Picture this. It is February 1916. The temperature outside has plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. The wind slices through the mountain passes of eastern Anatolia like a blade drawn from ice. The ground is buried under meters of snow so dense and so hard that soldiers have stopped trying to dig trenches and instead are carving shelters directly into the frozen earth with picks and bare hands. You are standing on the walls of Erzurum. Behind you, a city of minarets and stone fortresses that has never fallen to an enemy in living memory. Around you, tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers in their heavy winter coats, rifles trembling not from fear, not yet, but from the cold that seeps through every layer of wool and leather and pride. And in front of you, descending from the mountains, moving like a dark tide through the snow and the wind and the gray February light, 100,000 Russian soldiers. And they are not stopping. Feel that for a moment. The fortresses of Erzurum had held for centuries. They were not some improvised defensive position slapped together in panic. These were layered stone walls, artillery bastions, interlocking fields of fire designed over decades by engineers who understood war. The Ottoman Empire had poured blood and gold and prestige into this place because they understood something that every empire eventually learns. There are cities you cannot afford to lose. Erzurum was one of them. So here is the question burning in your mind as you watch those Russian columns moving closer through the blizzard. How does an army assault a mountain fortress in the dead of winter and win? How do you take a city that an empire has spent generations fortifying, defended by tens of thousands of desperate soldiers with their backs against the wall, when the weather itself seems to be fighting on the defender's side? Think about that. The answer is not what you might expect. It is not overwhelming numbers, although the Russians had those. It is not superior technology, although that played a role. The answer involves one of the most daring operational plans in the entire First World War. A plan that military historians still study today. A campaign so audacious that it shocked both sides when it succeeded. And succeed it did. Spectacularly. Devastatingly. With consequences that reverberated not just across this frozen mountain range, but across the entire collapsing architecture of the Ottoman Empire itself. Before we go deeper, I want to say something directly to you. If you're watching this, you're the kind of person who doesn't just want the surface version of history. You want to understand the tactics, the psychology, the desperation, the genius that drives these pivotal moments. You want to feel what it was like to stand in those mountain passes with everything on the line. And that is exactly what we are going to do together today. So if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button because we tell history the way it deserves to be told. Immersive, honest, and without pulling punches. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing the map of this community light up every time we release an episode. And if you're a returning viewer, you already know what this is. Let's get into it. Here is something that gets lost when historians reduce the Battle of Erzurum to a single entry in a list of First World War engagements. This was not just a battle. This was not just one army defeating another army on one particular frozen hillside. What happened at Erzurum in January and February of 1916 was a moment when the map of the entire world shifted. When the trajectory of millions of lives, not just soldiers, but civilians, whole peoples, entire ethnicities, bent permanently in a different direction. The Ottoman Empire in 1916 was already fighting for its life on multiple fronts simultaneously. In Gallipoli, just months earlier, the British and Anzac forces had been repulsed in one of the war's most brutal campaigns. That victory had given Constantinople a desperately needed boost of morale. It had proven that the Ottoman military could still fight, could still hold, could still make the great powers bleed. But the Eastern Front, the Caucasus frontier, told a different story. Control of Erzurum meant control of eastern Anatolia. It was the hinge point, the anchor. Lose Erzurum, and the entire Ottoman position in the east collapsed like a wall with its cornerstone removed. The city sat at the intersection of the main roads connecting Constantinople to Persia, to the Caucasus, to the oil fields, to the whole strategically vital Eastern Empire. It was the key to Anatolia itself. And beyond the purely military calculation lay something even larger, even more consequential. This was 1916. The Armenian genocide was unfolding across the same mountains, the same valleys, the same roads that these armies were fighting over. The political and territorial struggle for Anatolia was not abstract. It was written in the fate of entire civilizations. Russian advances here emboldened certain factions. Ottoman collapse here accelerated certain catastrophes. The war in the mountains of eastern Anatolia was not a sideshow. It was a crucible in which the modern Middle East was being forged. When Erzurum fell, it sent a shockwave through Istanbul that changed the political calculus of the entire Ottoman war effort. It altered troop deployments. It changed alliances. It opened Russia's path toward an Ottoman heartland that had never before been genuinely threatened. In a different world, had this battle gone differently, had those Russian columns been stopped in the snow and sent back in disorder, the whole subsequent history of the region might have followed a different path. That is what is at stake here. Not just territory, not just a city. Civilization-level consequence, forged in minus 30-degree temperatures in the mountain passes of the Armenian plateau. Let that sink in. To understand how Russia ended up attacking Erzurum in February 1916, you need to go back. You need to understand the disaster that preceded this moment, and how that disaster created the conditions for one of the most extraordinary reversals in the entire history of the war. The year is 1914. The Ottoman Empire has just entered the First World War on the side of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A decision that would ultimately accelerate its own destruction. The man behind this fateful choice is Enver Pasha, the dashing, ambitious, dangerously overconfident minister of war who imagined himself as a new Napoleon, a conqueror who would rebuild the Ottoman Empire's lost greatness through military genius and personal audacity. Enver Pasha had a vision. He would strike at Russia not through the conventional approaches, but through the Caucasus Mountains, a theater that the Russians would never expect, that would outflank their entire defensive line, that would connect the Ottoman Empire to the Turkic peoples of Central Asia, and create a vast, revitalized, tyrannic empire stretching from Istanbul to the borders of China. It was a grand vision. It was also a catastrophic one. In December 1914, Enver Pasha personally took command of the Ottoman Third Army and led it into the Caucasus in winter. He had approximately 95,000 men. He was operating in terrain that reached altitudes of over 3,000 meters. He was attacking in December, without adequate winter clothing for his troops, without sufficient supply lines, without a realistic understanding of what winter warfare in the Armenian plateau actually meant. The Russian Caucasus Army, commanded initially by General Vorontsov-Dashkov and organized in depth around prepared positions, was waiting for him. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre conducted by the elements, as much as by the enemy. At the Battle of Sarikamish, which we could spend an entire episode on, and perhaps we will, Enver Pasha's army was destroyed. Not defeated. Destroyed. Of the 95,000 men who began the campaign, approximately 77,000, were killed, captured, or, most horrifying of all, simply frozen to death in the mountain passes. Entire divisions ceased to exist. Men were found standing frozen at their posts, rifles still in their hands, because they had died too quickly even to fall. Enver Pasha escaped. He went back to Istanbul and told a somewhat different version of events. The Third Army that remained, the battered, traumatized, undersupplied survivors, was left in the Caucasus to hold the line as best they could. Their commander changed. Their morale was shattered. Their numbers were a fraction of what they had been. And on the other side of the mountains, a new Russian commander was about to take charge, who would look at this broken, demoralized Ottoman force and see not a defensive problem, but an extraordinary opportunity. Think about that transition. The very arrogance that destroyed Enver Pasha's army in 1914 had simultaneously depleted the forces that needed to defend Erzurum in 1916. One man's catastrophic overconfidence had set the conditions for a disaster that would unfold 2 years later. History works like that sometimes. The seeds of defeat are planted long before the battle begins. Before we talk about what the Russians were about to do, you need to understand what they were up against. Because the Ottoman defenses at Erzurum in late 1915 and early 1916 were genuinely formidable. This was not a weak position. This was not an army on the verge of collapse. Erzurum itself had been a major fortress city since Byzantine times. The Ottomans had inherited and expanded an already impressive defensive architecture. By 1916, the city was surrounded by a ring of forts. 11 major fortifications arranged in a defensive arc that stretched across the mountain ridges to the north and south of the city itself. These were not improvised earthworks. They were permanent stone and concrete structures with pre-positioned artillery, interconnected trenches, and mutual fields of supporting fire. The Deva-Boynu line, the outer defensive perimeter, blocked the main approach through the Palandokan Mountains to the south. Fort Tafta, Fort Krobandede, the Kargabazar positions to the north, each one a fortress in miniature, each one designed to support the others. An attacker who broke through one position would find himself under fire from 2 more. It was a defensive system built on the principle of depth. No single breakthrough would be decisive. The Ottoman Third Army defending this position numbered roughly 80 to 100,000 men by various estimates, though significant numbers were sick, poorly equipped, and still traumatized from the Sarikamish disaster. But even a diminished Ottoman army in prepared mountain positions represented an extraordinary challenge. The Turks were fighting on their own ground. Their supply lines, while strained, were shorter than the Russians. The terrain favored the defender. Every ridgeline was a natural fortress. Every valley was a natural kill zone for attacking infantry. And there was another factor that made the Ottomans seem nearly unassailable. Winter. The conventional military wisdom of 1916 was unambiguous on this point. You did not launch major offensive operations in winter in the Caucasus. The mountains between Russia and Erzurum reached heights that made movement difficult in summer and nearly impossible in winter. The passes filled with snow meters deep. Temperatures crashed to levels that killed men who stopped moving for more than a few minutes. Supply and logistics, already nightmarish in these mountains in summer, became almost impossibly complex in winter. Every major army on every major front in the First World War had learned the same lesson. Winter stopped offensives. The Ottomans knew this. Their entire defensive posture was built partly on the assumption that the Russians would wait for spring before launching any major assault. They were using the winter to rest, regroup, resupply, and reinforce. Their commanders were planning for a spring campaign, not a February one. The mountains themselves seemed to guarantee their safety. Imagine standing on those ridgelines, looking north toward the Russian positions. Seeing the snow-covered slopes, the frozen valley floors, the bitter wind driving ice crystals horizontally across the landscape, and thinking, nothing is coming through that. Not in February. Not in this. They were about to be catastrophically wrong. The man who would prove them wrong arrived on the Caucasus Front in January 1915, almost exactly a year before the campaign we're discussing. His name was Nikolai Nikolaevich Yudenich, and he was about to become one of the most underrated military commanders of the entire First World War. Yudenich was not glamorous. He did not have Enver Pasha's theatrical flair or his gift for self-promotion. He was stocky, methodical, and almost aggressively unglamorous in his personal manner. Where Enver wore his ambition like a uniform, Yudenich wore his competence like armor. He had served in the Russian-Japanese War, had seen what overconfidence and poor logistics could do to even the most powerful army, and had drawn conclusions that his contemporaries largely ignored. He was 53 years old. He had spent his career in the unglamorous work of military administration and planning, building expertise in logistics, supply, and the grinding mechanics of keeping large forces operational in difficult terrain. He was exactly the wrong kind of man to lead a dashing cavalry charge. He was exactly the right kind of man to figure out how to move 100,000 soldiers through the Caucasus Mountains in the middle of winter without killing them all. When Yudenich took command of the Russian Caucasus Army, he inherited a force that had just performed brilliantly at Sarikamish, but that was exhausted, overstretched, and operating at the end of supply lines that were inadequate for the scale of operation required. The Russian army in the Caucasus was the forgotten front. The real war, as far as Moscow and Petrograd were concerned, was happening against Germany and Austria-Hungary in the west. The Caucasus was secondary, a sideshow. Resources were allocated accordingly. Yudenich did not complain. He worked with what he had. For most of 1915, while the great catastrophes of the war were unfolding, Gallipoli, the German offensives in Poland, the endless slaughter on the Western Front, Yudenich was doing something that military historians have come to recognize as extraordinary. He was building, quietly, methodically, without fanfare. He reformed the supply system, understanding that logistics was not a support function, but the fundamental enabler of any military operation. He stockpiled ammunition, food, winter equipment, and medical supplies at forward positions, not behind the lines where they were safe, but up where the troops would actually need them. He studied the terrain obsessively. He sent out scouts, not just to gather intelligence on the enemy, but to map routes that conventional military thinking would have dismissed as impassable. He talked to local guides, Armenians, who knew every fold in these mountains, every hidden valley. Every route that the Ottomans had decided was too difficult for a major army to traverse. And crucially, he trained his men for winter warfare. This was not something the Russian army did systematically in 1915. Yudenich made it his priority. Troops learned to sleep in snow shelters. They learned to maintain their weapons in extreme cold. They learned to move cross-country on skis and snowshoes when the ground would not support wheeled transport. He equipped them with proper winter gear, felt boots, heavy sheepskin coats, gloves that allowed men to still operate their rifles. He was building an army that could do what no one believed any army could do. And he was waiting for exactly the right moment. That moment came not from a strategic calculation about weather or terrain, but from a political crisis on the other side of the world. In January 1916, Russia received an urgent message from its British ally. The Gallipoli campaign had failed. The British were evacuating. And now, with Ottoman forces freed from that front, there was a serious danger they would be redeployed east, potentially reinforcing the very army that Yudenich was planning to attack. The British, now fighting their own desperate campaign in Mesopotamia around Kut, desperately needed Russia to act. to strike, to pin Ottoman forces in the Caucasus before they could be transferred south. The window of strategic opportunity was closing. Yudenich had been waiting for permission. Now he had it, and an urgency that gave him exactly the justification he needed to launch his winter offensive. He had spent a year preparing for this moment. The question was whether his preparation would be enough. Here is the moment that transformed this from a military operation into something personal, something that burned with the kind of intensity that drives men to attempt the impossible. It is December 1915, roughly 6 weeks before the Russian offensive will begin. The Armenians of eastern Anatolia have been living through hell for the better part of a year. The deportations and massacres of the Armenian genocide, ordered by the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks who ran the Ottoman government, are ongoing. Entire communities that had lived in these mountains for thousands of years have been driven from their homes, marched into the desert, or simply killed. The Armenian volunteer units serving alongside the Russian Caucasus Army are fighting with a desperation that goes beyond patriotism or military duty. They are fighting for the lives of their families, their villages, their people. Every ridge, every valley, every frozen pass has the weight of civilizational survival behind it. Among Yudenich's forces, this awareness creates a particular kind of intensity. The Russian general understood, even if the politics of the situation were complex, that his campaign had a moral dimension that transcended the purely strategic. Erzurum was not just a military objective. It was, in the minds of the Armenian volunteers, and in the broader consciousness of the campaign, a city where the assertion of power over the region might at least partially restore order against the chaos that had consumed the civilian population. And there is another psychological dimension. The humiliation of Sarikamish, the memory of what Ottoman overconfidence had done to itself, the knowledge of what Russian winter warfare could accomplish, sat in the consciousness of every officer on both sides. The Ottoman commanders knew that winter attacks were possible. They had not forgotten Sarikamish, but Sarikamish had taught them the wrong lesson. It had taught them that winter attacks fail, that the mountains are the defender's friend, that cold and snow protect the fortified man from the assaulting one. What they had not considered was that a different kind of attacker, an attacker who had spent a year preparing specifically for winter warfare, an attacker who understood the terrain as well as they did, an attacker who had pre-positioned supplies and equipped his men for the cold, might not be defeated by those same mountains. The Ottoman commanders were preparing for the Russian spring offensive. They were managing their winter as a period of recovery and reorganization. When Russian reconnaissance increased in late December and early January, the Ottoman intelligence assessment concluded that these were probing attacks, harassing operations designed to keep them off balance during the quiet season. They were not quiet attacks. They were Yudenich measuring the ground, taking the pulse of the defensive lines, finding the weak points, confirming the routes that his winter-trained assault forces would use when the moment came. On January 10, 1916, Yudenich ordered the offensive to begin. He had 150,000 men. He had built his logistics, he had prepared his forces, and he had chosen February, the dead heart of winter, the moment when every conventional military calculation said attack was impossible. Precisely because that was when the Ottomans would be least ready. The trap was already sprung. The Ottomans just didn't know they were inside it yet. Let me walk you through this campaign the way a military commander would think about it. Because the tactical genius of what Yudenich pulled off at Erzurum deserves to be understood, not just admired from a distance. Imagine Erzurum as the center of a clock face. The city sits in a high valley, surrounded by mountain ridgelines. The main approach from the east, the direction the Russians were coming from, runs through a series of defensive lines, that the Ottomans had constructed across the most natural invasion corridors. These defensive lines, anchored on the forts we discussed earlier, were positioned to channel any attacking force into killing grounds where Ottoman artillery and infantry could be concentrated. The conventional approach would be exactly what the Ottomans expected. Advance along the main roads and valleys, throw infantry against the fortified lines, conduct siege operations against the forts. This was the textbook approach, and it would have been enormously costly, probably so costly that even Russian numerical superiority might not have been enough to force a result before the spring thaw, when the Ottoman position would strengthen. Yudenich rejected this entirely. His plan was built on a concept that military theorists would later call deep envelopment. Instead of attacking the Ottoman main position frontally, he would use multiple axes of advance simultaneously, including routes through terrain that the Ottomans had considered impassable, to threaten the flanks and rear of the defensive line before it could be reinforced. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to get past a locked door. The conventional approach is to batter the door down. Yudenich's approach was to find the window on the side that no one was watching and go through that while creating enough noise at the front door that nobody noticed. The operation began on January 10th with what appeared to be a series of conventional frontal assaults along the main line. Ottoman forces responded as expected, reinforcing threatened positions, committing their reserves to hold the line. The fighting was brutal and real. This was not a feint in the sense of being bloodless. Men died on both sides in genuine battle along the fortified ridgelines. But while this was happening, Yudenich's special winter-trained units were moving through the mountains to the north, through passes that the Ottomans had classified as impassable in winter, through routes that required men to break trail through chest-deep snow, to haul artillery pieces by hand over ridgelines, to navigate by compass and stars because visibility was too poor for visual landmarks. This is the moment to appreciate what Yudenich's preparation made possible. In 1916, moving artillery through mountain passes in winter was not a matter of engineering solutions. There were no helicopters, no snowcats, no modern logistics. It was men, human beings, in minus 30-degree temperatures, physically dragging heavy weapons through impossible terrain because their commander had trained them to do it, had equipped them to survive it, and had convinced them it was possible, because he had spent a year preparing exactly for this. The Kargabazar mountains to the north of Erzurum, which the Ottomans had left lightly defended precisely because they believed the terrain made a serious attack impossible, began to see Russian infantry infiltrating through the snow. Not a trickle, an army. Yudenich's right wing, commanded by General Vorobyov, was threading through the mountains and beginning to appear on the northern flank of the Ottoman defensive line. Simultaneously, on the southern flank, again, through terrain the Ottomans had considered secure against winter attack, other Russian forces were advancing through the Palandokan Mountains. Think of the Ottoman tactical situation. You are a commander, watching your main defensive line hold against Russian frontal attacks. You are satisfied. Your defensive plan is working. And then the reports start arriving. Russians in the Kargabazar positions. Russians moving through the southern mountains. And suddenly, the defensive line you were so proud of, those interlocking forts, those overlapping fields of fire, begins to feel less like protection and more like a cage. Because if the flanks collapse, the main defensive position does not become more secure. It becomes a death trap. January 28, 1916. 17 days into the offensive. The situation for the Ottoman Third Army is deteriorating faster than their commanders can process. The northern flanking movement has achieved something that, even now, strains belief. Russian forces, winter-equipped, specially trained, moving through what the Ottomans had mapped as impassable terrain, have not just crossed the Kargabazar Mountains. They have emerged on the other side and are beginning to threaten the flanks of the entire Ottoman defensive line. Fort Kargabazar, which was supposed to be covering the northern approach, is now itself threatened from the rear. The Ottoman commander in Erzurum, Mahmud Kamil Pasha, is receiving reports that seem contradictory and impossible. How are there Russians in the north? How have they come through those mountains? He has officers who have been insisting for weeks that the Kargabazar approaches are impassable. Those officers are now explaining how the impossible has occurred. This is the moment when overconfidence begins to transform into something more dangerous. Confusion, doubt, the creeping fear that your fundamental assumptions about the battle you are fighting are wrong. Mahmud Kamil Pasha begins to shift reserves northward to deal with the emerging threat. This is the rational response, the only response available to him. But shifting reserves northward to block the flanking movement means weakening the central position, the very position that is currently under direct Russian attack. Yudenich watches the Ottoman response with what we can only imagine as quiet satisfaction. He has read this situation correctly. Every reserve battalion the Ottomans pull from their central line to deal with the flanking threat is a battalion that can no longer stop the frontal assault. Every unit committed to plugging one gap creates another gap somewhere else. The Ottoman defensive system was designed for a straightforward frontal assault. It was not designed for simultaneous pressure from multiple directions, with forces appearing from terrain that should have been impassable. The elegance of the design that was supposed to be its strength, those interlocking, mutually supporting forts, is now becoming its weakness. Because the whole system assumes the attacker will come from a predictable direction. Change the direction of attack. Threaten multiple points simultaneously. And suddenly, the same interlocking design means that weakness in one place transmits immediately to everywhere else. Let me give you a modern metaphor to understand this. Imagine a sophisticated electronic security system. Multiple cameras, multiple sensors, interlocking alarms. The system is brilliant against someone who tries to walk through the front door. But it was all designed around certain assumptions about how a threat would approach. Find an angle the designer did not consider, and suddenly that sophisticated system is not just ineffective, it is actively confusing, generating false information, overwhelming the defenders with contradictory signals. Yudenich had found that angle, and now he was widening it. On February 10th, he gave the order for the general assault. Everything. Simultaneously. The frontal attack, the northern flanking force, the southern envelopment. All of it at once, before the Ottomans could stabilize any single sector. The temperature was minus 25 degrees Celsius. The Russians attacked anyway. Imagine standing there on those fortified ridgelines, watching the Russian infantry come on through the snow. Watching them advance, even as your artillery tears gaps in their lines, and they close up and keep coming. Watching soldiers who should, by any rational calculation, have stopped. Stopped for the cold, stopped for the terrain, stopped for the losses, and realizing that they are not going to stop. That is when panic begins, not because of a single catastrophic event, but because of the dawning realization that the enemy is doing something you believed was impossible, and that your entire defensive plan was built on the assumption that they wouldn't. February 11th, 1916. The Kargabazar heights fall. Russian infantry, who have spent weeks fighting through terrain the Ottomans called impassable, emerge on the commanding ground north of the main Ottoman defensive line. They bring their artillery with them. And suddenly, the forts that have been anchoring the Ottoman northern flank are exposed. They are no longer the dominators of the terrain. They are targets. The Ottoman northern wing begins to crumble, not collapse. Not yet. Ottoman soldiers fight with genuine courage, The Janissary tradition runs deep. Men die holding positions that are already tactically lost because they have been told to hold, and they hold. Fort after fort becomes a scene of savage close combat as Russian assault troops reach the walls and the defenders refuse to surrender, even when surrender would have been the rational choice. But courage without coherence is just expensive. Without coordinated movement, without reserves, without a command structure that can process information faster than it is being overwhelmed by events, courage produces martyrs rather than victories. Fort Tafta falls. Fort Krobandeti is flanked and isolated. Its garrison, surrounded, fighting without resupply, finally breaks. The central line, already weakened by the withdrawal of reserves to deal with the flanking threats, cracks under the weight of the renewed Russian frontal assault. Russian infantry pour through gaps in the defensive line. The interlocking system of forts, designed to support each other, begins to fall in sequence as each breach allows the next position to be attacked from a new direction. Mahmud Kamil Pasha faces a choice that no commander wants to face. The choice between ordered retreat and disorderly rout. He chooses retreat, but the communications infrastructure that would have allowed an ordered withdrawal has been disrupted by the speed and scale of the Russian breakthrough. The retreat becomes something less orderly than intended. February 15th. Russian advance elements are approaching the outskirts of Erzurum itself, the city that the Ottomans believed would hold until spring, that generals had assured Istanbul would be impregnable, is falling. The civilian population is fleeing. Ottoman soldiers who have held their positions through weeks of brutal winter combat are now streaming west through the snow, trying to outrun the Russian pursuit. The fortresses that were supposed to protect the city are either fallen, abandoned, or being bypassed. 11 major forts, built over decades, designed to defend Erzurum against any conceivable assault, and they have been overcome in a campaign that lasted barely 5 weeks. February 16th, 1916. Russian forces enter Erzurum, 5 weeks, in the middle of February, through the Caucasus Mountains, against a defended fortress city protected by 11 forts, in minus 30-degree temperatures. Yudenich has done what everyone said was impossible. The Ottoman Third Army has lost the battle. More than that, it has lost its coherence as a fighting force. The retreat west is desperate, disorganized, and costly. Russian pursuit forces harry the withdrawing columns through mountain passes where the cold is almost as lethal as bullets. Ottoman casualties in the campaign, killed, wounded, captured, and dead from exposure, reach somewhere between 40 and 60,000 men. The Third Army, which entered the campaign already weakened from Sarikamish, now barely exists as an organized military force. Short sentences now, because this is what collapse feels like. Guns abandoned in the snow, artillery pieces too heavy to move, left on ridgelines for the Russians to capture. Ammunition dumps exploding as retreating forces destroy what they cannot carry. Soldiers separated from their units, wandering through blizzards. Officers who cannot find their men. Men who cannot find their officers. 100 years later, the images you might conjure of disorganized, desperate retreat, that is what Erzurum's fall looked like from the Ottoman side. The fortress that would hold forever, held for 5 weeks. And now, it is gone. The fall of Erzurum on February 16, 1916, sent a shockwave through Constantinople that the Ottoman government would never fully recover from. The immediate military consequences were severe. The loss of Erzurum opened the road west toward the Anatolian heartland. In the weeks and months following the fall, Russian forces continued to advance. Trebizond, the important Black Sea port city, fell to a combined Russian land and naval assault in April 1916. Bitlis and Mush, fell in March. The entire Ottoman position in eastern Anatolia was collapsing. The psychological impact in Istanbul was perhaps even more significant than the territorial one. Enver Pasha, whose 1914 disaster at Sarikamish had set the conditions for this defeat, was now watching his grand strategic vision, the tyrannic empire stretching east, not just fail, but reverse catastrophically. The Committee of Union and Progress, already ruling through fear and authoritarianism, tightened its grip as military failure bred political paranoia. Resources that had been earmarked for other fronts were desperately redirected east. Operations in Mesopotamia and Palestine were disrupted. The overall Ottoman war effort, already stretched beyond what the empire's economy could sustain, was stretched further. For Russia, Erzurum was a genuine triumph. Yudenich became a national hero. The campaign was studied by military theorists across Europe who were struggling with the fundamental problem of the Western Front. How do you break through a fortified defensive line? The answer Yudenich had provided: deep envelopment through seemingly impossible terrain, winter training, meticulous logistics preparation, simultaneous pressure on multiple axes, would influence military thinking for decades. But here is the tragic irony that history insists on delivering. Russia would not enjoy its victory for long. The year 1916 would bring more catastrophes for Russia on other fronts. The Erzurum Offensive, the most successful Allied operation of the entire war, would bleed Russia of men it could not replace. By 1917, the Russian home front was in revolt. The February Revolution would topple the Tsar. The October Revolution would bring the Bolsheviks to power, and the new Soviet government, desperate for peace, would sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, surrendering not just Erzurum, but all of the territory Yudenich had conquered, returning it to the Ottomans. The city that had been taken at such extraordinary cost, through such extraordinary preparation and courage, would be given back by politicians sitting around a table in Belarus. That is often how history works. The soldiers who achieve the impossible in the field are not always the ones who determine what that achievement means. Yudenich himself would go on to lead the White Army during the Russian Civil War, coming within miles of Petrograd before being defeated by Trotsky's Red Army. He died in exile in France in 1933. The man who had taken Erzurum, outlived by the empire he had served, which no longer existed. The Ottoman Empire would survive the First World War, barely, only to collapse anyway in the aftermath of the peace settlement. The territories that Yudenich had captured and then lost became part of the Turkish Republic under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who built something new from the ruins of what had been. And Erzurum itself, that frozen fortress city, that hinge point of empires, today sits in eastern Turkey, the city of minarets and mountains. The forts that Yudenich's men stormed in February 1916 are still there, crumbling into the hillsides, their walls pockmarked and weathered. If you walk those ridgelines today, you can still find the ghost of the defensive lines. Still feel the wind coming off the mountains with that particular sharpness that has nothing to do with the calendar month. The dead are long since gone, but the landscape remembers. So what does Erzurum teach us? It teaches us something about preparation, about the relationship between the year of unglamorous work and the 5 weeks of visible triumph. Yudenich did not win in February 1916 because he was lucky. He won because of 12 months of systematic, methodical, unsexy preparation that nobody in Petrograd was paying attention to. The brilliant stroke of the offensive was only possible because the boring work had been done first. How many times in life is that true? The overnight success that took a decade. The decisive moment that was actually the payoff of years of preparation nobody saw. We celebrate the charge through the mountain pass, We forget the 12 months of stockpiling supplies, training for winter warfare, mapping routes through terrain everyone else dismissed. It teaches us something about assumptions. The Ottomans were not stupid. Their defensive plan was not poor. It was constructed on a set of assumptions about what an attacker could and could not do in winter in those mountains. Assumptions that were entirely reasonable based on prior military experience. The problem is that Yudenich refused to be constrained by prior military experience. He built an army that could violate the assumptions the Ottomans had built their defense on. Think about that in whatever domain you inhabit. The greatest vulnerabilities are almost never in the places where the defenses are strongest. They are in the places where the defenders have convinced themselves that no attack is possible. The places labeled impassable on the map, and it teaches us something about the brutal gap between military achievement and political outcome. Yudenich's soldiers climbed mountains in -30 degrees and broke an Ottoman army and captured a fortress city that had held for centuries. 2 years later, diplomats gave it back. The gap between what is won on the battlefield and what is determined at the peace table is one of history's most consistent tragedies. Men die for objectives that their governments surrender. They always have. And that knowledge should make us humble about the cost of military glory, even genuine military glory. The soldiers in those mountain passes in February 1916, Russian, Ottoman, Armenian. On all sides, they suffered and bled and froze in conditions that most of us will never experience. Their courage was real. Their sacrifice was real. The outcome was real. But history is long, and what looks like a turning point often turns out to be a bend in a road that keeps going somewhere none of the participants could have predicted. I want to hear your thoughts on this. The Battle of Erzurum is one of those campaigns that doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves in Western accounts of the First World War. The Caucasus Front is one of history's great overlooked theaters. Brutal, complex, morally weighted with the tragedy of the Armenian genocide, and strategically decisive in ways that shaped the Middle East we know today. Was Yudenich one of the genuinely great military commanders of the First World War? He never got a Haig or a Ludendorff's reputation. He never commanded the quantities of men that the Western Front generals marshaled. But what he did in February 1916, with what he had, in the conditions he faced, might be more impressive, tactically and operationally, than almost anything achieved in the more famous theaters of the war. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I mean that. I read them. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me which part of this hit hardest for you. Tell me if there are other forgotten campaigns of the First World War you want us to cover, because there are remarkable stories from every front that deserve to be told, with the depth and intensity they deserve. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the moment. We release these deep dives regularly, and we are building towards something, a complete, immersive history of the First World War, told campaign by campaign, battle by battle, commander by commander, the way it actually was, not the simplified version. You don't want to miss what's coming next. And remember this, as you go back to your day, away from these frozen mountains and shattered fortresses and the ghosts of men who marched where no army was supposed to march. The impossible is usually just the improbable that someone bothered to prepare for.